On June 24, 1982, something unimaginable occurs on a British Airways Boeing 747. Miles over the Indian Ocean, all four engines have abruptly failed and lost power. Now the huge plane is falling. Just a few minutes remain for the pilots to start the engines before they, along with the 261 passengers and crew, perish in the water underneath. What comes next is a remarkable story of perseverance, cooperation, and most importantly, composure under duress. I've sent an invitation to the skipper to share the narrative. This is the account of Flight 9 of British Airways. In Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, on the evening of June 24, 1982, a British Airways Boeing 747 carrying 248 passengers, the majority of whom had boarded the aircraft at London's Heathrow Airport nearly a day earlier, was being waited upon by 3 pilots and 12 flight attendants. For the passengers, the voyage was somewhat lengthy. Flight 9 had landed in Kuala Lumpur after stopping over at Bombay, India, the day before after departing London. The aircraft will now proceed to Perth before making its way to Melbourne, from where it will take off on the last portion of its voyage to New Zealand. The crew who had flown into Kuala Lumpur a few days earlier were fresh, and they would need to be when they got onto their enormous aircraft and made their way up to the cockpit, while many of the passengers were already exhausted from the lengthy travel. They were about to embark on the biggest challenge of their careers, and they had no idea. As they battled an unseen opponent thousands of feet above the Black Ocean, everyone on board would depend on their ability and tenacity to survive. But for now, everything was as it usually was. Captain Eric Moody was in command of the flight. He was 41 years old. He was one of the youngest captains, 7, 4, and 7, of British Airways. He had logged thousands of hours in a variety of aircraft, expanding his experience as a pilot. And as fortune would have it, he had begun his flying career as a glider pilot, a skill that would prove to be surprisingly beneficial this evening. First Officer Roger Greaves, age 32, and Flight Engineer Barry Townley Freeman, age 40, joined him in the cockpit. Specifically, the flight engineer had extensive expertise and was well versed in the aircraft systems. He actually served as a training flight engineer, passing along his knowledge of aircraft system management to incoming flight engineers. Stated differently, the passengers could not have been in more capable hands. That evening at 7:45, the massive aircraft backed out of the Kuala Lumpur gate. The travelers took their seats and began the 5-hour drive to Perth. In actuality, the flight started 30 minutes later than expected due to the delayed arrival from Bombay, traveling to New Zealand from the United Kingdom. Normally, passengers wouldn't care so much about a 30-minute delay, but it would prove to be fateful on this particular night. The aircraft was taxied out to the Kuala Lumpur runway by Captain Moody. On this portion of the trip, he would be operating the aircraft. There was light wind and clear skies. The weather was ideal for flying. However, the team did not realize that catastrophe was about to strike was brewing deep inside the Earth's crust. That evening at 7:45, the massive aircraft backed out of the Kuala Lumpur gate. The travelers took their seats and began the 5-hour drive to Perth. In actuality, the flight started 30 minutes later than expected due to the delayed arrival from Bombay, traveling to New Zealand from the United Kingdom. Normally, passengers wouldn't care so much about a 30-minute delay, but it would prove to be fateful on this particular night. The aircraft was taxied out to the Kuala Lumpur runway by Captain Moody. On this portion of the trip, he would be operating the aircraft. There was light wind and clear skies. The weather was ideal for flying. However, the team did not realize that catastrophe was about to strike. The 248 passengers were served dinner, and Manny tried to get some sleep in order to adjust to the new time zone at their destination. The pilots were served dinner as well, which included a tray of satay, a Malaysian specialty. As the plane cruised along smoothly at 37,000 ft, the pilots carried out the standard en route checks. They checked their fuel supply against the flight plan's fuel specifications. They made standard radio contacts to air traffic control and verified that the autopilot was keeping the aircraft on course. Captain Moody stood up once to go to the lavatory. Before leaving, he made sure there was no weather in the forecast by checking the weather radar. And sure enough, the bright night sky ahead was in front of us. But a bizarre phenomena lit up the cockpit in a matter of seconds after he left. The phenomenon known as St. Elmo's fire, which happens when electrically charged particles discharge on the windscreen and other front-facing elements of the aircraft, causing what appear to be miniature lightning strikes, lit up the cockpit winches. The first officer or flight engineer seen this event many times before. It's a very innocuous occurrence. However, there was something odd about this specific exhibit. It usually only occurs when the aircraft is passing through or close to a thunderstorm. However, nothing was visible to the pilots of Aircraft 9 on their weather radar. What might be the reason behind this show? The crew activated the seatbelt signs and set the engine start switches to continuous ignition as a precaution. This final procedure would guarantee that the engines would continue to run even in the event that they absorbed large amounts of ice or rain. However, the effect grew more intense as the seconds passed. The team was astounded by the extreme brilliance of the spectacle and soon realized that it was the most powerful St. Elmo's fire they had ever seen. A flight attendant was instructed to fetch the captain by Townley Freeman and First Officer Greaves. As he made his way back upstairs, Captain Moody was downstairs conversing with a flight attendant at that very moment. He noticed something odd. Here's how he described it in a conversation I had with him for this episode. As I went up the stairs, the circular staircase at the back of and as my eyes got to the level with the floor, I could see this smoke billowing in from around what I call the skirting. It's where the air conditioning air came in. And even more concerningly, it had an unusual smell. And I could smell this acrid electrical burning smell, which at the time was typical of the London tube. The captain was now on high alert, where electrical wires smoldering in the electronics bay beneath the cockpit and onboard fire is one of the worst things that can happen to an aircraft, and they've been responsible for hundreds of passenger fatalities over the years. If there was a fire on board, Moody would have less than 20 minutes to get the plane to an airport. Anticipating that he would inform me that there was smoke or fire in the electronics downstairs, I went to the flight deck. Could they light the extinguisher on fire? However, what he found when he returned to the cockpit was not overly concerning. It wasn't his colleagues hurrying through fire drills, but rather the most amazing demonstration of St. Elmo's fire he had ever witnessed. The spectacle of lightning bolts of different sizes, shapes, and colors flashing up and down their windscreens had the three men completely mesmerized. After strapping himself into his seat, the captain looked at his weather radar. Based on his observations, St. Elmo's fire only occurred when there were thunderstorms or a high, thin layer of cloud known as cirrus. But after tilting the radar dish up and down, scanning for storms, he could see nothing. This was truly baffling. It seemed as though he had come upon St. Elmo's fire in the open sky. Seemingly the same effect had spread to the engines as he turned his head back out to gaze at them via his side window. Their blue glow seemed to come from within. Furthermore, the leading edge of the second wing was as bright as a hot knife. Officer in the lead. Greaves noticed the exact same thing on his side as he peered back out his window. Still, the show had not ended. It was, in actuality, barely getting begun. The flames on the windscreen of the St. Elmo was quickly replaced by an even more spectacular show. Thousands of tiny blue tracer bullets appeared to be flying toward the windshield. The plane seemed to be going to accelerate to warp speed and plunge into another dimension. The pilots were taken aback. How in the world could this be happening? Other than that, nothing else pointed to anything being unusual. There was no vibration, no shaking, and no odd noises. Everything went smoothly up until that night at 29. The fourth engine. Abruptly, the right-hand outboard engine failed. The flight crew started to turn off the engine as soon as Captain Moody called for the engine shutdown checklist. This included arming the fire handle in the event of an engine fire, putting the thrust lever on idle, and turning the start lever to cut off, which cuts off the fuel supply. While engine failures weren't infrequent, they weren't particularly concerning on a plane with 4 engines like the 747. The airplane could operate flawlessly with 3 engines. But the engines 2 and 3 failed without warning, and engine 1 failed right after, and the pilots had hardly finished the checklist. The pilots found it hard to believe. Every one of the 4 engines had given out. Their enormous jet, which could accommodate 263 passengers and crew members, was now the biggest glider in the world. And now, with every passing minute, it was getting closer and closer to the ocean below. Within a few short seconds, their unusual situation had gone from awe-inspiring to life and death. The fate of everyone on board now depended on whether the pilots could somehow salvage their crippled aircraft before it plunged into the Indian Ocean below. We didn't believe it was happening. We just could not believe that all 4 engines were failing. We went through a whole period of disbelief. It's almost unprecedented for all engineers to fail simultaneously on a passenger jet. For that to happen, it's almost always because the pilots had done something wrong. With this in mind, the captain checked the fuel pumps. Had he and his crew accidentally set the engines to draw fuel from only one tank, which then ran dry? But sure enough, when he checked, the fuel pumps were drawing from every tank. Well, what about the electrical system? Moody checked the circuit breakers, but found no issues there either. Was it frosting, or what? It was not impossible that ice had jammed the engines at that altitude. He activated the anti-AI system on the engine, but that didn't seem to be the problem either. The 3 crew members had to push their feeling that they had made a mistake to the back of their brains. Now, their sole mission was to restart the aircraft's engines as they plummeted towards the Indian Ocean in a life-or-death situation. In a matter of minutes, they would plummet into the sea below if they were unable to accomplish this. While he and the flight engineer proceeded over the checklist to restart, the captain instructed the first officer to report a mayday to air traffic control the engines. As they did this, the captain began turning the plane back towards Jakarta. At their high altitude, there was a danger that the loss of thrust from the engines would slow the plane to the point where it would stall and fall out of the sky. The pilot maintained speed by pitching the aircraft's nose down to prevent this. In terms of physics, there was a fine balance to be achieved here. The aircraft's height represented potential energy that the captain had to exchange for kinetic energy in the form of speed. However, even with the most accurate flying in the world, it wouldn't stop the inevitable if the other pilots couldn't restart the engines. Without motors, the plane lost 1 kilometer of height for every 15 kilometers it traveled forward, from a height of 37 feet. This indicated a 165-kilometer range for the pilots. On the bright side, that was sufficient to glide to Decatur, the closest airport. Or it would have been, were it not for one important thing. Between the aircraft and Jakarta was a massive wall of mountains 3.5 kilometers high. There was no way the plane would be able to make it over the mountains from its current position. This meant that if the pilots couldn't get the engine started, they would have to do the unthinkable. They would have to turn around and ditch their fully loaded 747 on the ocean at night. They knew well that this meant almost certain death for everyone on board. The pressure they were under was tremendous. And though they didn't know it yet, the worst was still ahead of them. For some reason, the first officer was unable to get his message through to air traffic control over the radio. He tried again and again, but the controller seemed completely unable to understand him. The controller seemed to think that the number 4 engine had failed. The rightmost engine went. What the first officer was telling him was that all 4 engines had failed. For one thing, there was an element of sheer disbelief on the part of the controller. All 4 engines don't just fail on a modern passenger jet, but it wasn't just that, unbeknownst to the crew or anybody else. Flight 9 had flown directly into an ash cloud thrown up by the Mount Calhoun volcano on the island of Java. Static electricity released from the dry ash caused the light show that the pilots saw on their windshields. Amazingly, this had produced an electromagnetic cocoon around the plane, sabotaging any radio communications the pilots were sending or receiving as it zipped through it at nearly 1,000 km/h. The controller found it very challenging to understand what the pilots were saying as a result. Fortunately, a Singapore Airlines Boeing 747 traveling the same route was only a few dozen miles behind Flight 9. Because they could hear the first officer more clearly, the pilots on that flight communicated his messages to air traffic control in Jakarta. At last, the people on the ground realized how serious the crew's position was, wishing to avoid falling victim to the same circumstance. In the cockpit of British Airways Flight 9, the Singapore Airlines pilots made a U-turn. It was the pilots alone. To make their predicament even more peculiar, their plane's condition did not correspond with what they had rehearsed in the simulator. To start with, the lights in the cockpit were illuminated, despite the almost complete absence of electricity. Furthermore, certain systems that should not have been functioning were operating, while others that should have been functioning did not. We were like a bar magnet going through the ether. We were making our own electronic field around us, bad magnet, field and back. That accounted for it holding in, I think, some relays that should have collapsed and otherwise vice versa. So I think that we had electronics not working, that should have been working because the relays had collapsed and vice versa. We had certain things that were working that shouldn't have been working because relays were held in. Oddly enough, the autopilot was one of the functional systems. The pilots benefited greatly from this. As the autopilot was activated, the captain could assist his colleagues in relighting the engines. Within the passenger cabin, the travelers were in a panic. The plane was falling toward the water below, and the familiar sound of the engines had given way to an unsettling silence. Acrid electrical smoke wisps started to flow into the cabin, making some of the passengers cough upward and stinging their eyes. Most of the first-class passengers in the cockpit directly behind the pilots were fast sleeping. The pilots were not even thinking about the smoke, which under normal conditions would cause them great concern. There was something far more immediate and dangerous to deal with. The engines would not restart in spite of their repeated attempts. The altimeter was winding down, second by second, like a clock that wound down to zero. The allotted time was up. The pilots could not add any time to this clock, but they could use the remaining time to try as many engine restarts as possible. But there was a lengthy and complicated procedure for starting the engines again. They would only have a few chances to restart the engines before they struck the sea if they followed every instruction. If we'd followed the book, we'd be dead. On one occasion I said, "Forget the book." The pilots shortened the checklist to only the most essential items and went through it again and again and again as the altimeter counted down to zero. The adrenaline in the small space of the cockpit was through the roof. But then, in the midst of their dogged attempts, came an unwelcome warning the plane was beginning to depressurize. Without engines to feed air into the cabin, the air was beginning to leak out at their current altitude of 26,000 ft. There wasn't enough oxygen to sustain life. The pilots hurried to get their oxygen masks on. However, it broke in First Officer Greaves' hands when he attempted to put it on. Having successfully put on their own, the other two crew members could communicate with one another using the built-in microphones. However, the first officer, who was essential to the crew's attempts to restart the engine, was now uninformed. Not only that, but he would quickly go unconscious in the absence of sufficient oxygen in the environment. Captain Moody was faced with a very difficult choice. Should he drop to a lower altitude to save his colleague, or should he maintain his valuable height to give himself more chances to restart the engines? The captain and flight engineer discussed their options and came to a decision. I've got a recollection that my engineer agreed that we got down to 20,000 ft. We could all take a rock myself, and then we were back as a crew. So it was decided the captain was going to make a risky bargain. It was either stupid or brave, one or the other. He intended to exchange valuable altitude for the opportunity to use his first officer. He depressed the aircraft's nose and pulled the speed brake handle. As the jet descended, the passengers' guts shot up into their mouths. The airflow over the wings was interrupted by the speed brakes, causing the entire aircraft to tremble and quake. The purpose of this dramatic maneuver was to reunite the first officer with the rest of the squad in the cockpit. Again, Moody chose to discard the checklist, even though it instructed the pilots to extend the landing gear during this quick descent. He knew that if he were to put the aircraft down in the ocean, extended landing gear would cause the plane to dig into the water, tearing it apart. In a minute, the plane lost an incredible 6,000 feet. Now at 20,000 feet, Captain Moody took advantage of the speed brakes to drastically slow down the plane's drop rate during the dive. Under extreme strain and impending hypoxia, it was the first cop who had put his oxygen mask back together. Now that they were back together, the three men felt a greater sense of urgency to restart the engines because they were at their considerably lower altitude of 20,000 feet. And as if all of this wasn't terrible enough, the captain now realized there was another issue. The first officer reported that the plane was traveling at 320 knots, but his airspeed indicator indicated that it was traveling at 270 knots. This difference was vitally important. In order for the engines to restart, the plane needed to be flying up between 250 knots and 270 knots, outside of this narrow window. And it just wouldn't happen. So again, the captain was faced with a tough decision. Which instrument should he believe? If he made the wrong call, it's possible that the engines won't start again. He made the decision to hedge his bets by changing the aircraft's pitch up and down rather than making an educated assessment as to which one was correct. Its speed would be adjustable by him. alternating between a period of time in the proper speed window as indicated by his instruments and a period of time in the correct speed window as indicated by the instruments of the first officer. As he drove through the proper speed window, he hoped that eventually his colleagues would figure out how to start the engines. However, the passengers witnessed a terrifying scene as the pilots attempted to restart the engines. Bright tendrils of flame began shooting back from the engines. The inside of the cabin was being lit up red and orange as hot flames rushed by outside. It was like something out of a nightmare. Not only was the plane hurtling towards the ocean as the cabin filled with smoke, but now its engines were on fire. Some passengers screamed, others began writing notes to loved ones, hoping that they would be discovered after the plane had crashed. This fire was unknown to the pilots, but if it had been known, it would not have worried them too much. Naturally, feeding and lighting fuel into the engines was a step in the process of restarting them. This ignition would typically occur inside the engine, but in this case, the engine failed. Massive jets of flame were created by all of this gasoline flashing back from them and igniting outside the engine. In an attempt to calm the passengers, the captain made the decision to speak at this point. One of the greatest instances of understatement in aviation history would be his words. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have a small problem. All 4 engines have stopped. We are doing our damnedest to get them going again. I trust you're not in too much distress." At the end of this message, he also asked the chief flight attendant to come to the cockpit in British Airways. This was code for the flight attendants to prepare the cabin for a crash landing or a ditching in the water. The head flight attendant rushed up to the cockpit, and Captain Moody briefed him on preparing the cabin for a ditching in the ocean. But the flight attendant was unable to understand Moody through his oxygen mask. He figured that rather than ask him to repeat himself in what was clearly an inopportune moment, he would be best to leave the pilots to it and get back to preparing the cabin. The pilots have tried restarting the engines well over a dozen times now, and still there were no signs of life. They had to make a tough decision. Similar to the airport, a massive mountain range loomed in the darkness ahead of them, and they wouldn't be able to get over it without engines. Captain Moody then issued a directive to the crew. By the time the plane reached 12,000 feet, if they couldn't get the engines started, they would turn around and abandon it in the nighttime ocean with no way to see the ocean awaiting them. The pilots would have a very difficult time making a ditching survive. The abyss really lay underneath them. However, the pilots continued despite how dire things appeared to be. Obstinate in their attempts to get the engines running again. We were all bloody-minded people. My granny brought me up to believe that in the English language, there's no such word as count. You're a can-do boy. So I wasn't going to give up. The other 2 were from the North Country, and they don't give up in anything. And the engineer was a training engineer, and the first officer was a very, very competent North Country lad, even though it was forbidden by the checklist. The captain also made the decision to attempt starting engine number 4. They hit the fire handle when initially shutting it down in case there was an engine fire. It is not permitted to attempt to restart the engine after doing this. But in their case, there was no protocol that was more important than starting the engines again. Ultimately, if their goal was to restart only one of their engines, there was a quarter of a probability that it was the 4th engine. The altitude at which the pilots had planned to turn around and ditch by was approaching 12,000 feet. If the engines hadn't been started, then all of a sudden, after countless attempts, engine number 4 roared back to life. The pilots were overjoyed. Captain Moody pushed the engine to maximum thrust, enabling him to stretch the plane's glide that much further. But one engine would not be enough for them to clear the mountain range. The pilots needed at least one more. The seconds ticked on as the crew, buoyed by their success with engine number 4, continued their efforts on the other 3 engines. 30 heart-pounding seconds later, engine 3 came back online. Now the crew were in with a real chance. The other 2 engines were forced back to life a minute or so later, forcing the pilots back into their seats as they increased in power. As the first officer put it, the crew was back in business. The captain notified the passengers when the first officer radioed air traffic control that they had successfully restarted all 4 engines. Moments away from making contact with the ocean, there had been avoided disaster. However, their ordeal was far from ended. The crew was still in the dark about what had transpired. The cause of the engine's failure was unknown to them. They had no idea why they had begun over either. They were afraid the engines would give out again at any moment. so they had one priority: to put some distance between themselves and the sea below to CARTA control. Cleared the flight up to 15,000 FT, and Captain Moody put the aircraft into a climb. But as the plane reached 15,000 FT, the St. Elmo's fire reappeared. The pilots weren't going to take any chances this time. Once we got back up to 15,000 FT, I did say, right, there's something happening here. Let's get out of this. It was fairly obvious that there was something happening outside that was causing an airplane not to behave properly. The captain immediately began descending, but as he descended, engine 2, the inner engine on the left-hand side, began shaking violently. Number 2 engine began to surge, and I've never heard a violent surge like it. Rocked the airplane. It was a big boom boom, and it rocked the airplane like mad, such that I felt it might throw itself off the wing. The skipper made the decision to turn off the engine because of the intense vibration. With only 3 brittle engines remaining, the crew of Flight 9 would have to make a slow and painful return to Jakarta. The skipper would subsequently characterize this next section as the most difficult of the entire trip because of the 2 unpleasant revelations that awaited them. At 10,000 feet over Jakarta, the pilots were flying through complete darkness. They made the decision to leave the thrust levers in their original positions until the plane was only a few minutes away from landing, because they didn't want the delicate engines to break down again. To control his speed, the captain extended the flaps and the speed brakes. He was using aerodynamic drag to counteract the thrust from the engines. But as the crew flew over the city and prepared for their approach, air traffic control gave them some bad news. The glide slope at the airport wasn't working. The glide slope is one of the 2 components of the instrument landing system, the other being the localizer. It gives the crew precise vertical guidance down to the runway. It is necessary for the pilots' jobs. Things are about to get really busy. The captain would need to be informed of the appropriate height at various runway distances by the first officer, who would need to swiftly piece together a virtual glide slope. Given that it was a clear night and the pilots could see the runway from a great distance, this wouldn't have been a major issue under normal circumstances. However, there was another surprise waiting for them when they formed a line at the runway, with Jakarta's city lights. Curiously, though, there was just a dark void where the airport used to be. The pilots were familiar with the location of the runway because they had made numerous flights into Jakarta to the city, but for some reason, it seemed like nothing was there. The first officer called the tower and asked them to turn the runway lights up, and sure enough, a few seconds later, the airport appeared right where they expected it to be. But there was still something odd. It appeared as if the whole city was shrouded in mist. The weather forecast was for it to be perfectly clear outside. What could be causing this? The pilots tried the windscreen wipers, but these had no effect. They then wiped down the windshields themselves in case condensation had formed on them. But still, the view out the window was blurry. They couldn't make out any level of detail, just little specks of light. Subsequently, the captain observed a narrow strip of transparency extending along the left side of his windshield. Through it, he had superb visibility of the runway. He was determined to find the cause of this immediately, even if it was somewhat weird. As soon as possible, he had to land in order to prevent further problems with his aircraft. Leaning on the left window pillar, he moved over in his seat to acquire a clean view of the runway. Pitch and power were carefully adjusted by the captain, who was leaning on the window post during the delicate process. He was given directions by the first officer regarding heights and speeds. Then, passing over the runway threshold, the captain pulled the engines to idle. The first officer counted down the plane's altitude. 50, 40, 30, 2010. Touchdown. The captain eased on the brakes and let the nose wheel fall onto the runway. The passengers erupted in applause. They had just survived one of the most horrifying ordeals ever experienced on board a passenger aircraft. The pilots, too, were massively relieved, but they were still flummoxed. What on earth could have caused this bizarre quadruple engine failure? We were towed in when we landed. While we were waiting to be towed in, I went downstairs and sat on my hands on a table in the first class. I returned upstairs to my seat when I felt the tug, and when I did, I noticed that my hands were black. According to Barry, the flight engineer, that appears to be volcanic dust. "Don't be bloody stupid," I said. "From where did that originate?" It was a casual remark, but it was the first time a volcano had been mentioned. After a few hours on the ground, we were seated in the first class when a local French crew boarded the aircraft, and the captain announced, after we'd been talking a bit and we told him what happened. He said, "I think you've flown into a volcano." And he said, "One's been erupting down the coast or since April." Well, that put the warning bells in our mind ringing because that should have been no-timed. So, Barry, Roger, the first officer ran back upstairs, got our paperwork and devoured everything in. And he said there's no mention of a whale of a volcanic eruption in there. So I said, keep that. That's our evidence. And that was the second time. And the third time the next day, we went back to the airport to do various things and to look at the airplane in daylight. And I was stood under the one of the engines when a chap came up to me and said, "Hello, my name is Senator. I'm a Rolls-Royce rep out here doing something with a Garuda." Towards the conclusion of our talk, he said to me, "I think you flew into a volcano. Thus, don't worry," he said. "You were caught up in the eruption that occurred last night." "We don't know what we did, so let's hope it's something like that," I remarked. Nevertheless, when I woke up the following morning, there was a local English newspaper beneath the door with the headline, "Mount Gallangal Downs Jumbo." I found out later that it was actually 48 hours later. This contact with volcanic ash has far-reaching effects on the aviation industry. Above all, it sparked the creation of the Volcanic Ash Advisory Centers, or VACE. There are now 9 of these centers set up, covering the entirety of the world's airspace. Their sole purpose is to monitor volcanic activity and send out warnings to aviation authorities when volcanic ash clouds pose a threat to air travel. If you think back to 2010 when a volcano erupted in Iceland, shutting down most of Europe's airspace, you can see how effective these centers have been at preventing similar incidents from happening again. I'll give Captain Moody the last word for a final reflection on this incident. My only regret is that the Queen did not award medals to my flight engineer and first officer. I believe British Airways management was incredibly careless in that regard. And to treat them disrespectfully, that was quite the tale indeed. I've posted my entire interview with Captain Moody on Patreon, so you can watch it right now along with everyone else. Or, if you want to watch even more videos in one sitting, there's a great playlist right up here. Once again, I appreciate your time, and I hope to see you soon for the next episode.